the millennials and Gen Z now are actually 50% and climbing in terms of proportion of our global population. And so if you think about how much that matters to our future growth, it truly is time to wake up to what we call the next consumer powerhouse of Generation Z. And if we also take this one step further on what this means to consumer spending power, Gen Z is now 40% and counting of global consumer spending. So what does this mean to our businesses as we look at even the influence they have on household decisions, not just out of their own pocket, but how they're influencing increasingly their own parents on choices that we're making, products that we're bringing, experiences that matter into the household. And this is just going to keep growing and growing as we look at spending habits across categories. All right, so as we think about the dynamics of Gen Z, what's really important, and you'll see a little bit more of myth busting on Gen Zs versus millennials, but they're not the same. And often we talk about, all right, let's go after this next generation. We're now seeing more and more of our brands shifting that strategic target from millennials to Gen Z as we look at future growth and understanding what truly teases them apart. Don't forget that they are 40% and climbing of consumer spending now, which means, what does that mean for the future? It's only going to climb. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, understanding that impact of the holistic environment that they're raised in is very important. So what are those societal, political, climate changes that are influencing the way they think, the way they grow, the way they're shaping, the way they really fight for a change and a cause, and responding to the volatile environment around them.
This is a generation that really wants to take responsibility for the future, and they push for global change. And there's lots of examples of this. I think probably one of the most well-known ones is obviously Greta Thunberg and her school strikes for climate change. And that's obviously continued around the world. And they want to be heard because they realize they have to deal with, in the future, decisions that are being made now. So they really take responsibility for that. The second trend that we're going to talk about is diversity. So Gen Z are the most diverse generation to date. So for example, in the US, 52% are non-Hispanic white versus 61% of millennials. So you can see there, as immigration continues, Gen Z will become majority non-white by 2026. And also different types of diversity, right? So gender diversity, for example, 32% of Gen Z personally know a person who prefers a gender neutral pronoun versus 19% of millennials. So you can see the shifts that are happening and that are going to continue to happen. And Gen Z really celebrate this diversity, and it's a real core part of who they are. And the last thing is digital natives. And again, Santhi has mentioned this. They are the first truly digital native generation. They could swipe right before they could crawl. And they've never known a time without the internet, Wi-Fi. And social media has really become a huge part of where they connect with others. It's so integral to that. 2018 data shows that 95% of US teens have access to a smartphone, and 45% say they're online almost constantly, which is compared to 24% in 2014. So obviously you could have probably predicted that, right, that's gone up. However, there's this dichotomy, this mixed view, right? So they are on the internet a lot, social media a lot, but they understand how that impacts their mental health. So for example, 56% of UK Gen Z consumers say they're concerned about the mental health implications of using technology devices too often. And this is awareness that will continue as a theme through some of the other things we talk. So next slide, just showing a few segments from, there was the New York Post and the Guardian, but Gen Z in their own words. And this is really around that volatile environment and taking responsibility for the future. So firstly here you can see Kendi's 15 in the US and is already exhausted by the world around her at 15, right? And is frustrated by the fact that she wants to try and make a change, but she's been held back because of her age. Next, we have Anthony in France, who knows the future will be unstable. He already knows that. And the impact that it has is the good things that they're experiencing now, they think about how that's going to cost future generations. And I think that's really a bit of an insight into their psyche, that they're already thinking about what I do now will impact the future. And lastly, we have Olivia, who's 16 in the UK, and talks about how the pandemic has affected her life and the life of other young people. And that even though they've been hugely affected, they have still been pushed to the back of the queue. And I really feel that. And that her generation faces a lifetime of pain for the pandemic. So really, she's only 16 and has already seen a difficult future in the years to come, and that she'll have to pay for things that are happening now, and decisions that are being made now. So it kind of brings to life the real concerns of Gen Z as they grow up in this uncertain world, in a world where they want to have control, but in fact, sometimes they don't have so much control. So now Santhi will take you through more details of that uncertainty and the events which have actually shaped their lives.
Thanks, Anna. So as you consider some of those dynamics between millennials and Gen Z, we thought it would be helpful to do kind of a side-by-side on some of those current events that were really milestone moments that have shaped globally how these two generations view the world. And so we mentioned the millennials grew up in a time more of idealism, but also faced a lot of strife, a different type of strife that Gen Z is currently experiencing. But you'll see more of the focus on global war terrorism. 9/11 was part of the upbringing of early millennials, the mortgage crisis, and then of course you have more of the Hollywood-esque situations like Tiger Woods and the like. But that also shows kind of where celebrities were more engaged in millennials' time. And so you'll see that impact how we think about influencers as well, and who influencers are for the generations. And so if you look at Gen Z, meanwhile, the world of economic uncertainty is real. The world of climate change is also increasing. Role models have now become each other, where micro influencers of Gen Z actually impact each other. So you might see, still more of that following around, Taylor Swift's and Justin Bieber's of the world. However, more and more we're seeing small brands and startups becoming their own competition against each other. And then, of course, more recently, as you look at global events, anywhere from ISIS to Brexit to Trump and Biden, I mean, all of these are also very dynamic, conflicting experiences for Gen Z to understand what role they play in really driving change, to Anna's point. And much of this has really only heightened over the last year alone. So if you look at 2020, we've all been through it. We're continuing to go through the aftermath of the pandemic, but it's incredibly important to consider how these Gen Zers, who many of which are in, let's see, I have a middle schooler who's a Gen Zer, and I have, friends that are going through college and also trying to figure out what employment looks like, understanding what the life of quarantine is, which is something that no other generation really had to experience as we think about COVID, and also facing a lot of dynamics when it comes to acceptance. So look at the Asian movement as we look at unfortunate events of hatred in different populations. George Floyd created a huge global impact as we think about the world of really embracing diversity and thinking about how we can stand up for change. And you'll see here, I mean, even some of the posters on Gen Z stepping up. This becomes really important as we think about what is it that our brands need to do to step up in a holistic picture and stand for a cause beyond just performance, but truly what do we stand for as we touch their lives and help drive bigger impact. Anna mentioned the tidbit of swiping before crawling, but that's a real thing. My daughter, at least as a toddler, was navigating that smartphone faster than I could in my late 20s. And she was like 2 or 3 years old. So this is a lot of that function of how much technology they're just natively immersed in. And that's from day zero of entering the world. And again, unlike any other generation, this one has been born into technology, and they don't know a world without Wi-Fi, without multiple devices at a time. They are now more kitchen logic able to engage with technology, unlike any other generation. So while I'd like to consider myself a pretty digitally enthusiastic high adopter of being able to figure out that 3D TV and make my avatar that you might see in my Hopin profile here. They're meanwhile learning code. My son in kindergarten was learning how to code and do some, entry-level robotics in public school in Boston. We're going to show you a quick clip of the environment of digital impact and implications that Gen Z is growing up in. And just watch out for some of these stats, which should hopefully give you a sense of how real this environment is. 1 second. I want to acknowledge a couple things on their digital environment. So just reinforcing a couple things that Anna shared. More than any previous generation, these Gen Zers are, again, digitally native. However, it's important to consider the balance. So though they grew up in a world where digital is pretty much all they know, over the last year alone, it's important to think about the impact on mental health. And we mentioned that earlier, but nearly a quarter of Gen Zers in a global study recently shared that they felt that they were spending too much time online, especially on apps like TikTok and Instagram. And we're hoping that they could live in a world that was more real, organic, kind of face-to-face interactions. So the pandemic has actually heightened the sense of how do I balance, feeling connected when I'm so disconnected and always online. So it's important to think about what role our brands can play as we think about driving those connections.